For 9 months, Saddam Hussein was one of the most wanted men on earth. After the fall of Baghdad, the former Iraqi president disappeared. American forces searched homes, farms, safe houses, and entire communities, but Saddam remained out of reach. Then, on December 13, 2003, intelligence led US soldiers to a farm near Tikrit. They searched the property and found something that looked almost impossible: a tiny underground hiding place. Inside was Saddam Hussein. The man who had ruled Iraq for decades had been reduced to hiding beneath the ground. But how did the world's most wanted man end up there, and how did American forces finally find him? To understand why Saddam Hussein became one of the most wanted men in the world, we have to go back decades. Born in 1937 in the Iraqi village of Olaja, Saddam grew up in difficult circumstances before entering Iraqi politics as a young man. He joined the Ba'ath Party, a political movement that sought to unite Arab countries under a single nationalist ideology. Saddam gradually climbed the political ladder. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party seized power in Iraq. Saddam became one of the regime's most influential figures, building a powerful security apparatus and strengthening his control over the country. Then, in 1979, Saddam Hussein officially became president of Iraq. For the next 2 decades, he ruled with an iron grip. His government fought a devastating war with Iran. In 1990, Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War and international condemnation. Inside Iraq, Saddam's government brutally suppressed political opponents and uprisings, while international organizations documented serious human rights abuses committed under his rule. By the beginning of the 21st century, Saddam Hussein was no longer simply Iraq's president. He had become one of the most recognizable and controversial leaders in the world. And then came 2003, the United States and its allies invaded Iraq. Saddam's regime was about to collapse, and within months, the man who had ruled the country for decades would become the target of one of the biggest manhunts of the Iraq War. On March 20, 2003, the United States and its allies launched the invasion of Iraq. The operation began with airstrikes against targets in Baghdad, followed by a rapid ground offensive. Coalition forces advanced toward the Iraqi capital. For Saddam Hussein, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. His government was losing control. His military was being overwhelmed, and the coalition was closing in on Baghdad. Then, on April 9, 2003, the Iraqi capital fell. Images of Saddam's statue being pulled down in central Baghdad became one of the defining symbols of the invasion. But there was something missing. Saddam Hussein himself. The Iraqi president had disappeared. American forces searched locations associated with Saddam and his government, but the man they were looking for was nowhere to be found. For the first time in decades, Saddam was no longer ruling Iraq. He was a fugitive, and as coalition forces began establishing control over Baghdad, the search for him became a priority. The question was no longer whether Saddam's regime would survive. It was much simpler. Where was Saddam Hussein? And could he be found before he disappeared forever? With Baghdad under coalition control, the search for Saddam Hussein intensified. He had disappeared at exactly the moment American forces needed to know where he was. Was he hiding in Baghdad? Had he escaped to another part of Iraq? Or had someone helped him cross the border? Investigators had no definite answer. Saddam quickly became one of the highest priority targets of the American military. His face appeared on wanted lists, and intelligence teams began searching for anyone who could provide information about his whereabouts. But Saddam had an advantage. He knew Iraq, and more importantly, he knew the people around him. The former Iraqi leader had spent decades building a network of loyalists, security officers, relatives, and trusted associates. Now that network became his protection. Saddam moved between safe locations and relied on people he trusted to keep him hidden. American forces conducted raids and questioned people connected to his former government. But every lead seemed to produce another dead end. The manhunt stretched from weeks into months. And with every passing day, Saddam's disappearance became more embarrassing for the forces searching for him. The former president of Iraq had vanished. But investigators were beginning to realize that finding him would require more than searching buildings. They would have to find the people he trusted. And that would eventually become the key to the entire investigation. For months, Saddam Hussein managed to stay ahead of the search. He had lost his government, his palaces, and almost all of the power he once possessed. But he still had something valuable: people he trusted. Saddam relied on a network of loyalists and personal associates to help him move, communicate, and remain hidden. Instead of staying in one obvious location, he kept a low profile and avoided the kind of movements that could attract attention. Meanwhile, American intelligence teams were working to dismantle the network around him. They arrested members of Saddam's former government and questioned people who had been close to him. Every interrogation offered the possibility of another connection, and slowly, investigators began moving closer. One name became increasingly important: Ibrahim al-Muslat, a trusted member of Saddam's security network. Al-Muslat had been part of the former Iraqi leader's inner circle. If investigators could find him, they believed they might finally find Saddam. The search for al-Muslat intensified. Then, in December 2003, American forces captured him. What happened next would become the turning point in the entire manhunt. During questioning, investigators obtained information that pointed toward Saddam's hiding place near his hometown of Tikrit. After 9 months of dead ends, the search finally had something it had never had before: a specific location. Now the question was simple: was Saddam Hussein really there? The information investigators received changed everything. For 9 months, Saddam Hussein had been a moving target. Now, intelligence pointed American forces toward a farm near Ad-Dor, south of Tikrit. The location was significant. Tikrit was Saddam's hometown, and the surrounding area was known to contain people with long-standing connections to his former regime. American commanders began preparing an operation. It was given a name that would soon become famous: Operation Red Dawn. The plan was to search to suspected locations near the Tigris River. But there was still a problem. Intelligence is never a guarantee. The information could have been wrong. Saddam could have moved. Or the location could have been deliberately provided to mislead investigators. As American forces moved towards the area, the pressure increased. Soldiers had spent months searching for a man who had repeatedly managed to disappear before they arrived. This time, they had a new advantage. They weren't simply searching for Saddam. They were searching for a location connected to the people protecting him. And as the operation began on the night of December 13, 2003, American forces moved into the darkness around the farm. Somewhere nearby, they believed Saddam Hussein was hiding. But they still didn't know exactly where. And what they were about to discover would bring the 9-month manhunt to its final moments. Night had fallen over the countryside near Tikrit. On December 13, 2003, American forces moved into the area as part of Operation Red Dawn. The mission was straightforward: search the suspected farm compounds, and find Saddam Hussein. The operation involved soldiers from the U.S. Army's 1st Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, working alongside Special Operations Forces. They moved through the darkness, securing the area and searching the compounds. But the first searches did not immediately produce the man they were looking for. Saddam was still nowhere to be seen. For a moment, it appeared that another intelligence lead might have failed. Then soldiers began examining the area more carefully. They discovered signs that suggested someone had been hiding nearby. The search moved toward a concealed location on the property, and then they saw it, a small opening in the ground. It didn't look like a bunker belonging to a former head of state. It was cramped, concealed, and almost impossible to notice unless you knew where to look. The soldiers looked down into the small underground shelter. Inside was a man with a long beard, dressed in ordinary clothing. At first glance, he looked nothing like the powerful Iraqi president who had dominated the country's politics for decades. But the soldiers had found the person they were looking for. It was Saddam Hussein. The former president had been hiding underground in a cramped shelter near the farm. According to the U.S. Army's account of the operation, Saddam identified himself and said he was the president of Iraq. There was no final firefight, no dramatic escape attempt. After 9 months on the run, Saddam Hussein was captured alive. The man who had once ruled Iraq from palaces and presidential compounds was now being pulled from a hiding place in the ground. The discovery stunned the world. For months, Saddam's location had been one of the biggest unanswered questions of the Iraq War. Now there was an answer. He hadn't left Iraq. He hadn't disappeared into another country. He had been hiding near Tikrit, close to his hometown, in a shelter so small that the location would soon become known around the world as the Spider Hole. But the American forces still had to prove one crucial fact. Was the prisoner they had captured really Saddam Hussein? Within hours, the next stage of the operation would begin: identification. The capture was dramatic, but the military could not simply announce that they had Saddam Hussein based on appearance alone. They needed certainty. The prisoner was transported for further examination, while intelligence and medical personnel began the process of confirming his identity. Photographs and physical characteristics were compared with known images of Saddam Hussein. Biometric information was examined, and DNA testing provided another crucial piece of evidence. The results confirmed what the soldiers at the farm already believed. The man captured inside the underground shelter was Saddam Hussein. There was no longer any serious question about his identity. After 9 months of searching, one of the world's most wanted men was finally in American custody. The news was prepared for release, but before the announcement reached the public, Saddam remained under guard. For the first time since the fall of Baghdad, his location was no longer a mystery. He could not disappear again. The manhunt was over, and within hours, the world would learn that Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq, had been found alive. The reaction would be enormous. For some, his capture represented justice. For others, it marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter for Iraq. But almost everyone understood one thing. The most famous fugitive of the Iraq War had finally been caught. On December 14, 2003, the news became official. Saddam Hussein had been captured. After 9 months of searching, the former Iraqi president was finally in custody. The announcement immediately dominated international headlines. Television networks around the world broadcast images of the man who had ruled Iraq for nearly a quarter of a century. For the United States, the capture was a major victory. President George W. Bush addressed the American people and described Saddam's capture as an important moment for the Iraqi people and for those affected by his rule. But inside Iraq, the reaction was far more complicated. Some Iraqis celebrated the fall of the man who had ruled through repression and fear. Others feared what his capture could mean for the country's future. And supporters of the former regime were confronted with a new reality. Saddam Hussein had finally been captured. But his story was far from over. What happened after the spider hole? How did the former president of Iraq face his trial? What was he convicted of? And how did his story ultimately end? That's where the next chapter begins. Watch the next video to discover Saddam Hussein's trial, his final days, and the events that brought his story to an end. Subscribe to Beyond Belief Stories, because sometimes the unbelievable is real.